Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm happy that you guys came to listen to these wonderful speakers that we have with us today. So first, Professor Labropoulos, I would like you to open this. When we were preparing for this and brainstorming a bit about what we could talk about, then you said that classical studies can learn a lot from Greek poetry today. So do you want to maybe talk about that more and of whatever comes to your mind during your saying?
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Thessalian Poetry Festival for organizing this event and Maria for chairing our panel and inviting me. And I'll speak for just 5 minutes to put on the table a few issues, and then we can, after our presentations, we can have a discussion with the audience as well. Controversies about antiquity go back to the 1680s, 1690s, with a famous quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, or quarrel of the books in France and in England. And that reminds us that basically modernity has been always in a conversation or contestation with antiquity. There is no modernity without self-definition vis-a-vis the ancients. The ancients have been claimed and contested by all kinds of political, ideological positions, extreme right to extreme left, and that continues today. And then we have something quite specific, which is the field of classics, the discipline of classics. We have the larger domain of ancient Greco-Roman materials that float in our cultures. And then we have something that is a very specific project emerging in the 19th century, which is the discipline of classics. And as a discipline, that is something that is very well organized, structured, articulated. You cannot play around, fool around with it, because then it would not be a discipline. It would be something else creative. It so happens that, as we all know, the discipline of classics has been associated with various regimes, educational regimes, cultural regimes, administrative regimes. In the Western European and American world, going through a classical training was also training you to be in the elite of your country, the administrative, the political, even the cultural, the educational, even the financial elite. No wonder that at some point, and with special emphasis today, classics, again, the discipline of classics has been and is criticized for its complicity with colonialism, with imperialism, with various kinds of oppressive discourses. And that is why people on conservatives make it of paramount importance to save it, to salvage it and promote it, and radicals would like to see it undermined or even destroyed. Now, next to the discipline of classics, we have the larger, we have classics as a repertoire, as an assemblage, as a free-floating material that permeates many cultural domains. It is interesting that right now, oh, may I open a parenthesis? Since I was emphasizing the complicity of the classical discipline in administrative projects, I want to read something from today's New York Times. The title of the article is "Biden Revokes a Trump Order Seeking Classical Civic Architecture." Now, a few days after Trump was defeated, get this, after he was defeated, a few days after that, he signed an executive order in December called Promoting Beautiful Federal Civic Architecture. And in it, he, the government, obviously the president, praises Greco-Roman architecture as being beautiful while describing modernist designs as, quote, ugly and inconsistent. And so Biden comes, and one of the first things, as we can tell, yesterday, he revokes that order. Now, here is an example, brand new, from how the classical gets the Greco-Roman, gets colored, gets claimed by the extreme right, by very conservative, and needless to say, every architectural association in the United States condemned the Trump order and said this is unacceptable and so on. So at the same time, then, if we look at the classical architectural, for example, orders, there are still buildings and other things being built along classical lines. Operas are still composed with classical themes. In the arts, we have also strong classical influence. And in poetry specifically, I can mention very quickly Louis Glick, this year's Nobel, Anne Carson, of course, Rita Dove, the Black American poet, Ellis Oswald in England, and of course our own Phoebe. So none of these people are criticizing classical things, myths, stories, authors, and so on. So we have this, and that's the point I want to make with my brief presentation, is that we have these two very different works, domains of cultural creation. One that pertains to the discipline of classics, which is now sustaining these attacks and these criticisms, which to my mind are to a large extent very justified. For example, the complicity of classics with Trump's architecture, but at the same time, in the broader domain of cultural, artistic, and other philosophical, of course, creativity, we don't hear any calls against the Greeks and the Romans. On the contrary, we hear every day about a new production of a tragedy, a new film that is drawing on the Greeks and the Romans, and so on. And most interestingly, the more progressive classicists have been switching for a few decades now to the domain of classical reception. And instead of looking only at ancient authors, they look at how they are recharged, refunctioned in contemporary culture. I'll stop here.
So thank you so much. This is a very nice way to open everything, because except of offering us many good insights, solid insights, I think you opened more questions than you gave the answers, which I think is amazing for this type of interaction, which led me to think that maybe now it would be good that Tatiana says something about reception, because you mentioned this difference between classicism as a field and classics as corpus.
Okay.
So between field and corpus, I would like to talk about corpus first. Maybe to
Okay.
continue in this positive tone, and then we can give the critique by Roberto.
Okay, Maria. I'm not sure if I have a lot of positive things to say. I do think that my talk is in the same is along the lines of Vasilis. I think we are both concerned with really similar things, and I think in a way my talk can be seen as giving a few specific examples of things he talks about. I'm concerned about something that, you know, it is very hard to make to have these discussions from a global perspective, and all of us, we are in different parts of the globe, and I am particularly concerned as someone who loves classics. What happens, I think that the debate is very, very centered on what is happening in universities and at undergraduate and graduate levels. And I think that as a matter of fact, you know, classics is a very underfunded field, and at least, you know, from my experience in Portugal, it's relevant to think about how it works in schools. And it is very hard to teach classics to children. In general, it is a difficulty. And one of the main difficulties is it's very heavy legacy of as much of you know of cultural freedom and beauty and truth as kids would say, but also of oppression and how you tackle these and to talk about these things. And, you know, I do not think that it is possible to let classics burn. I think that the things that bother us about this cultural legacy need to be carefully covered and spoken about, if not for anything else, for the sake of not having them creeping through the back door in much more extremist versions. And, you know, that's something that I'm genuinely concerned with. So I prepared a really short presentation, and I hope I don't speak for more than 5 minutes. And I'm going to share first my desktop, and then okay. Can you all see my screen? Can you see the PowerPoint, everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's my PowerPoint. So my talk is basically about. Okay, I think this is it. Okay. So my talk is basically about three photographs. But one of the photographs is just a story of my past as a classicist who worked in schools for a really short while as a part of my responsibilities as a researcher in a small classic center. So the first photograph is a picture of the excavation of a statue that usually goes by the title of Boxer at Rest, as you can see. And archaeologists usually pinpoint the statue to about 10 BC, 100 BC, and attribute it to a sculpture called Apollonius. It was excavated on one of the slopes of Rome on the Quirinal, and today it can be seen in the Palazzo Massimo in Rome. It was possibly buried on purpose in order for it to be preserved for future days. And it is so striking because it is an extremely realistic representation of an old boxer. He's all battered. I think I can show you the next PowerPoint. I can try and show you in some detail. You can see he's all battered at the end of a fight. If you just look at his hands, his broken nose, his swollen ears. It is a statue that belongs to an absolutely magical moment in the history of the ancient world, when the art of the Hellenistic period moved from representations of the idealized beauty of athletes to a concern with realistic subjects. It is really a masterpiece of breathtaking realism. To some extent, we could say that it exists in the same spectrum of the social imagination as, say, the Italian neorealist movie Bicycle Thieves. It is, the representation of someone who is a lower class, struggling athlete making a living. The reason why I'm showing it here, however, is because classical archaeology, taken as a subdiscipline of classics, allows us to make a distinction between what is, as much as possible, an attempt at an objective study of antiquity, focused on finding and studying its material remnants. And you know, we can here try and draw an objective line between classics and its reception. If we assume that, if we want to assume that, you know, the discourses around texts and interpretations of texts are in themselves instances of reception, which I think it's a confusion that can be done. But you know, valid interpretations of texts are valid interpretations of texts. But we can try and be objective about certain things. These two things are, you know, not the same, although they get easily entangled. Is, you know, the subjective study of the classical world and its remnants and its reception. And a good example of how they get easily entangled can be seen here in one of its most violent manifestations on the subject of how they can be mistaken, and not always an innocent mistake. Here's another picture which indirectly points to a more controversial aspect, not just of the legacy of the classical world, but also of how classical tradition has been appropriated in contemporary history. This picture shows Hitler, Mussolini, and the archaeologist Ranuccio Bandinelli, all together in the complex of the baths of Diocletian in Rome. Bandinelli is showing Hitler the earth relief of the Pakis. As you can see, it's just an abstraction of the goddess Earth, erected in honor of the goddess of peace. The Roman Senate originally commissioned the relief in 13 BC to honor the return of Augustus from a 3-year military campaign in Hispania and Gaul, lands which equate roughly to today's France and Spain. This picture was taken in May 1938, when Mussolini and Hitler saw each other as allies. Augustus' altar of peace makes me uneasy about my relationship with the classical world for 2 reasons. Insofar as it contains allusions to war, it shows an extremely sanitized version of Roman actions in their military campaigns. And this is an extremely sanitized version for Romans then. The east wall of this frieze contains, which you cannot see, I couldn't find a proper picture. The east wall of this frieze contains a badly preserved image of what is possibly a female figure who symbolizes Rome, seated on top of the weapons taken from Rome's enemies. So on the one hand, we have a historical of Roman wars as aggressive imperialistic expansion, and also the bloody displays, often shocking for the ancient Romans themselves, of the generals' triumphs. And then this version of war for the purposes of keeping peace. Needless to say, this narrative has held considerable appeal to subsequent politically conservative ideologies. Mussolini was keen on identifying himself with Augustus so as to appear as the architect of the second rebirth of Rome. In May 1938, Hitler was a year and a half away from invading Poland, an event which took place on September 1st, 1939. And yet, here they are, both of them standing at the altar of peace. This picture that comes with echoes of some of the most disturbing aspects of the reception. This picture thus comes with echoes of some of the most disturbing aspects of the reception of the classical world. For instance, the use of classical past in a wider project of political propaganda by a fascist regime, and the populist legitimization of war, both in antiquity and in recent history. And so now I want to move to my last picture. Sometime around February 2010, I think this one was actually taken in November 2011. So, you know, a few months later, a little short of 72 years after the date on which Hitler paid a visit to Mussolini, I found myself in a school in the outskirts of Lisbon, alongside a couple of other junior researchers. You can see here one of my colleagues. The children who were students in this school were not very likely to have the classical world or even the uses and abuses of the classical past as their immediate concern. Having said that, the then head of the research center at which I was an employee thought it was relevant to send young researchers to these schools and have them spend 2 or 3 hours a month, and having us spend 2 or 3 hours a month teaching these children basic knowledge about the classical world and their languages. It was by far one of the most useful and rewarding things I ever did with my time. We would stand there explaining the meaning of the Latin mottos of Portuguese football teams and how the name of the Mars chocolate bar was related to the god Mars. For a while, we ran a version of this course in which we presented the benign and not so benign myths captured in Ovid's Metamorphoses, which, needless to say, contains scenes that need to be carefully framed for the understanding of 12-year-olds. I always came out of these sessions with an awareness that it exposed to these children a version of the world that was mysterious to them, where simple things that they would encounter every day could be seen and deciphered with fresh eyes. The sessions also allowed them to step into the past and realize in a split second that this past was not a foreign country. Sometimes, when reading lines of ancient poems with these children, I could not help but find myself thinking about a rather cruel set of 3 lines from a poem by Adrian Rich. I know you are reading this poem by fluorescent light in the boredom and fatigue of the young, who are count themselves out at too early an age. Which is something that, of course, explained why it was so important to try and do it. Classics, outside of the privileged world of elite schools around the world, is a massively underfunded discipline. And yet, it is nonetheless relevant as when it is embedded, it is nonetheless as relevant as when it is embedded in an educational framework. It can allow us to speak about topics as elevated as the origins of realist art and as low as the appropriation of the classical world for the purpose of political propaganda by extremist regimes. Neither of these two issues, which exist in the domain of classics as a discipline, should be eschewed, and both need to be very carefully taught. One for the obvious purpose that knowing about classical culture is something that immensely enriches one's life. Not making it more accessible only helps perpetuating the privilege of certain classes. So no, Homer should not be removed from the school curricula. And also because it provides us with the perfect excuse to discuss the mechanisms of social, racial, political, gender-related oppression, of which the classics are also a part. Both are vital, not just for the survival of classics as a discipline, but also for the sake of conveying ideas that are at least as hard to teach as they are vital: empathy, social awareness, an ability to question the assumptions by which we talk about ourselves and our cultural environment. It was, after all, Diogenes, the cynic philosopher, who told Alexander the Great to get out of the way because it was blocking the sun. Yeah, that's it.
I see. Thank you so much. It was so inspiring.
My pleasure.
I see. Roberto, Vasilis, Phoebe, you were reacting with your bodies to what she was saying. So before we go to Roberto's and Phoebe's 5 minutes, maybe do you guys want to talk together a bit about Vasilis and Tatiana's presentations?
Okay.
Or do you want to, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Why don't we hear everybody?
Okay, let's then hear everybody.
Yeah.
Yes. So, Tatiana, I think...
I need to mute myself. Yeah.
Tatiana, I think that you had... okay, Roberto, skip the transition and...
No. I just shared the screen. You
no,
can keep walking.
To see the screen is the best possible transition because now we know what's happening. Okay, no, I just wanted to make a small blending, small blending between you and Tatiana to say that, when she spoke about class, I think it was the most important the difference between whether the privileged class is using a certain accumulated knowledge, symbols, beliefs, traditions, or it is being used, in order to gain power or political goals, or whether it's being used in altruistic ways, such as Tatiana mentioned that she's using. So maybe some critical perspective could be, very interesting now to hear what you have to say. So go on.
Okay, sorry, let me just, I have a screen problem, so I have to move this over here. Yes, so thank you both for, thanks everybody for the invitation. Thanks, Marianne, thanks you both for, thank you both for your words. Yeah, this is a topic that is, I will certainly have many things to say about what both Susan and Tatiana had to say, but let's just get started with the main things that I wanted to talk to you about. This all comes from a situation where, as classicists, we are entangled, like personally entangled in this situation. Some people might feel that current attacks on classics are threatening their livelihood, that there is senseless destruction going on of things that they value. And this is a feeling that a lot of people, I guess, can identify with. Whether it is justified or not, that's a different thing. But I think a lot of people who have devoted years to studying Latin, Greek, to studying ancient authors, who have personal reasons which are very different and very diverse to be interested in these works, and also to be interested in the survival of antiquity in other media, in other fields, as we all are, might feel threatened or scared at what they might be seeing that's happening in different universities around the world, but mainly, in my opinion, in American universities, to some extent in British universities. And this is a thing that is also present everywhere else, but maybe in a less public way, because for reasons that I will try to go back to later on as well. So I think like being a classicist today, as it's always been the case, is complicated because it's fighting, especially when you're not a particularly conservative person, like I'm not, you're always fighting the impulse of being motivated by the sole desire to preserve things. Because we work with texts and fragments and objects that come from a world that we only understand by bits and pieces. We lack context, we lack meaning, we lack words. And these are objects that carry with themselves, by virtue of their own nature, the awareness of their insufficiency. It's just a fact. So we feel the need to safekeep these things, to preserve them to some extent. And the fact that we don't know that much about most of the productions, of the cultural productions of antiquity, that most of it has been lost, makes us even more anxious, and makes us realize that maybe why have we lost things that are even more important? What does it mean for us? Where is the intrinsic value of the things we seem to value so much? And many of the things we love, because I guess many of us love these things in what we now call classics, are also not only the objects themselves, but also images and projections of desire of other people that have read these texts for centuries, that have dealt with these material elements of cultures long gone. And I'm inclined to believe that maybe, yes, we can love and treasure these artifacts because they are intrinsically wonderful, but this is only something that we can believe as being true. But the more tangible fact is that at least part of our admiration comes from the respect and the admiration that others before us have felt for these things. And I want to talk about two examples of not only love and admiration, but of a complicated relationship with the classics, with antiquity, in particular in a region that is not very often, although it's become more recent, not very often studied as a place for classical reception. That's Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, and Roberto Bolaño, the Chilean poet and novelist. So Borges was painfully aware of that situation. He's, I think, in a way, a very paradoxical writer that in his own right embodies this dilemma of the marginal classicist. He's not a classicist per se, but he embodies the situation of a classicist like myself, who I come from Latin American country. I work in France, and I come from a place that is not a province, a former province of the Roman Empire, and a place that also does not believe, at least not now, that they are the empire reborn, as it sometimes happens in places like the United States, for instance. Borges was a character that was kind of in the same situation. He had a very ambiguous relationship to classics. He believed on the one hand, and this appears mostly in his public appearances in interviews, he uncritically claimed that everybody in the West, so to speak, was both Greek and Jewish, as though he really bought into the myth of Judeo-Christian roots of something that would be called the Western civilization. And of course, this is something that can be discussed, but let's say that there is this idea and that the public Borges believed in it. He also called for Latin and Greek to be mandatory in public high schools across Argentina at a moment where they were going to be removed as optional, made optional in high schools in the country, which is a particularly what we would call a particularly conservative move that seemingly supports this idea that, and I'm not saying that I disagree with the idea, but with the idea that Latin and Greek classics are intrinsically valuable, right? And yet, when you read his essays and when you go to his fiction, he always walks a much more subtle and much more ironic path, striving to undo, let's say, the Gordian knot that ties the tradition. And as you know, the only way of undoing the Gordian knot is by slicing it open. So Borges claims in an essay written in 1932, and this is the image you have. I will not read it. I'll just summarize what he says. He says that basically Argentinian writers, as most South American writers, are in a very privileged position because they don't stand in relation to antiquity and to the West in general in the same relationship of veneration. There is no idea, no sense that the tradition that they are writing in, because they're Argentinian, they're not European, is sacred. So just as, and he gives the example of Jewish intellectuals in Europe, he gives the example of Irish writers in England, in Britain, these people can write in a more original way, so to speak, because they are unconstrained by this idea that the classics are sacred. And in particular, this is particularly important when Borges writes about Homer, because he says something very interesting, and that is that his relationship to Homer is very different from that of, let's say, a philologist who can read the text, because he cannot, he just can't, he doesn't know Greek. So not knowing Greek for him is a strength. Why? Because he can read all of the different translations that are available to him, so he can understand Homer from the perspective of different translators that have read him before. And he doesn't believe that, for instance, the translation has to be necessarily inferior to the original. This gives you a Homer that is much more, that is enriched by the traditions, the different traditions that collaborate and work towards defining what kind of cultural object the Odyssey might be. And it also allows Borges to take a stab at Homer without making him bleed to death. This leads me, and I will be brief on this as well, to Bolaño, another South American writer who passed away in 2003 before he could complete his planned project of a trilogy inspired by Greek tragedy mainly. This is a trilogy formed by Nocturno de Chile, Amuleto, and a third novel that was never written. In Nocturno de Chile, we have a writer called a priest called Sebastián Urrutia, conservative Catholic priest, very well versed in the classics, who is hired by the military government of the military dictatorship to teach the junta, Marxism, and in order to be able to persecute and hunt down communists. Well, just before that, when the character a few years before, when the character learns about Allende rising to power, he withdraws and starts reading, surprise, the classics, the Greek classics. And this is the quote. I will let you read it. I just want to say that he superimposes references to contemporary facts in Chile during the Allende government with a very canonical, very dumb, I would say, list of Greek authors in chronological order. So I respecting the tradition, I started with Homer, then moved to Thales, and then a pro-Allende general was killed, and Chile restored diplomatic relations with Cuba, and so on and so on and so on, until he gets to Thucydides and the death of Allende. And then he is hired by the government and starts collaborating in destroying people's lives. Urrutia embodies, I would say, one of these different attitudes that exist for someone to relate to classics, to deal with classics, which is what I would call the naive approach to both classical works, classical artifacts, and classical reception. It boils down to the idea that Greek classics are literary monuments, lists of names simply, that are a source of accumulated knowledge and beauty, eternal truths that should be preserved and kept. And this is something that most people agree with. It is, however, I would claim, a more or less naive interpretation of what these works can be, because obviously they can be all of these things and more, but at the same time they can also be considered by the same token representatives of violence, means of justification of the most horrible crimes. We can think about the lives of classical authors, the lives of people in ancient times, as being the lives of people who owned slaves and committed acts that would be completely unethical today. I will go back later to a last example I had from the second novel, Amuleto, which is the complete opposite. A text where Auxilio Lacour, a poet from Uruguay, trapped in the philosophy department of the University of Mexico at the same time as the army is massacring students in Tlatelolco during the fateful night of 1968. And Auxilio has a vision, the vision of a tree, the shadow of a tree, or what she calls either the shadow of a tank or the shadow of a tree, extremely ambiguous image. The shadow of a tank or the shadow of a tree, which was like the portico or the porch of Latin literature, like the porch of Greek literature. I love Greek literature from Sappho to Seferis. And this realization pushes her towards resistance, towards fighting back. So, sorry, I spoke a little bit too long, but I think if there's something, and we can go back to these examples later, but I think if there's something that we can actually learn or try to think about from these complementary views on antiquity, is that antiquity will always, I mean, classical references will always put us in a situation where we are inevitably in a dilemma that we'll be faced with. I mean, we will always be faced with contradictory feelings about a tradition that is both tied to things that we might find beautiful and to uncomfortable or terrifying realities. And I think these texts can make us think about the paradox of someone who is both a classicist and an iconoclast, faced with a number of conflicting claims to identity between past and present. So again, I go back to this question. I think that Tatiana has answered it to some extent, but I would wonder why do we study these texts in reality? Who are these people we call the Greeks and the Romans? And what does it mean to study classics as a discipline? I think, and I will go back to this in our discussion, it is even more complicated than just considering that there's, on the one hand, classics, on the other hand, a reception of classics. And I think there's more of an entanglement that goes at least 3 levels deep and that we can discuss later. So I think that many of the answers that we hear very often are kind of misguided. We say that we study classics because they're great. They have things to teach us, maybe. Well, so does any literature in the world, for that matter. Yes, the Greeks gave us philosophy, democracy, so we say. The Romans gave us the law, impressive feats of engineering. It is true to some extent, but not only are they not the only ones, but we actually didn't get these achievements from them directly. They never gave us anything. We don't really know who these people are. And an important realization to be aware of is that we need to be aware of these gaps that separate us from antiquity, that to know who filled the gaps, how this course was corrected, what are the debates that bring us to the situation we're in, and how things got lost in the way. Otherwise, I think we're going to be still left with this bunch of ruins and marble dust that we have to make sense of. And I think it's good, but we need a little bit more. So sorry, I talked too much, but I hope I was clear.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I don't think it was too much. I mean, I think we all were following you with a lot of interest for it. New people joined, nobody left. So greetings to new people, and thank you all the guys for staying with us throughout the 3 presentations out of 4. Now we'll have the 4th presentation, Phoebe Anisi. Thank you so much for being so patient with listening to others. And maybe now you would like to say something too. Of course you would. So here you go.
Thank you, Maria, for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be with all of you and the auditors that are together. I think that I was lucky to be the last one because each of the other participants spoke about some important things that I am also interested to. For example, Roberto's mentioning to this final phrase, he said, "Who are those Greeks finally?" I think it's a very, very important subject. Also, I think the subject of loving or not loving what we are studying is another thing that is very important, and Tatiana, I think she also went inside this questioning by her presentation of how we can educate people through classics, and also the connection in between fascist regimes and classical studies. And I'm going back to Vasilis Labropoulos and his questions about the discipline and the history of the discipline and the use of classical, I don't know, I will speak about that later, of the word classical, of the use in modern poetry in a way that it's not traditional or conservative, but on the contrary, it's something, can be something progressive and questioning. I think that I am speaking also from Greece, and I have a different kind of attitude towards classical things. First of all, here in Greece, we don't use the word classical so much. We are speaking about ancient Greek civilization, and that's important. We also don't use, we really don't use the ancient Greek culture as a tradition, but as something more dangerous, let's say, as origins. I mean, when the modern Greek state was founded, we adopted in a way the German way of looking at us, and this way was a way of either identifying modern Greek people with ancient Greek people and finding a very big gap or a very big coincidence in between. And also the use of the rest of the history in a way that it would construct a line that would come from the so-called origins, ancient Greek origins, then coming from the Christian religion. So together, all this kind of not thought about that when Roberto was speaking about Borges and the Jewish and the Greek together. So it's the Christian and the Greek and then the Byzantine, and then we arrive to today's situation. So the problematic part for the modern Greek attitude towards the ancient Greeks was this kind of origins and line that would make a kind of autochthony, founding a relationship in between the modern Greek situation and the ancient Greek situation in order to justify the presence and the existence of modern Greeks. So it's very complicated for the Greeks, this question about ancient Greek culture, let's say. And at a certain point of our history, recent history, we had a kind of differentiation, and people who were more conservative were picking the Byzantine part of the history together with the Christian part of our history. And the more progressive communists and the leftists from the 30s and after were picking the ancient Greek part of our history. So I think that in a way I'm inside this picking off as a part of the progressive part of our history. But the things became more complicated recently when we had this new fascist party of the Golden Dawn that was using all the imagery and the symbols from ancient Greece in order to make them a symbol for their fascist and Nazi activity, which was also murderous. I want to go a little bit back and speak a little bit more personally. I think that for me, ancient Greek culture is like Bolano, I think. Is a kind of text, and as very well Vasilis Zambropoulos explained it, we can use it in a way as an assemblage of things that we find and we connect. And let's speak personally, something that I find and I connect in order to build my own narration. As we know, all questions of regarding products of the past have to do with the view of today, and which is the view of today that can adapt or not to the product that we are taking. So I think, first of all, we have a kind of, we can or we must, or I am for a kind of critical reading of the ancient Greek culture. And when we have this critical reading, we can also, as my professors did, I studied in France with Vidal Naquet and Detienne and in the School of Paris. My professors, they were contextualizing the ancient Greek culture, making it something like another culture, aside with other cultures, and they were working on a comparative kind of reading of ancient Greek culture and on an anthropological kind of reading of the myths, in a way that for me it was very fascinating, because in a way they were salvaging the ancient Greeks. They were making them salvages, but salvages in a non-colonialist way. I mean, they would make them equals to other cultures that were not the high classical culture. So they were degrading, in a way, the ancient Greek culture, in a way to make us understand how it's a product of a very ancient past, and it has the characteristics of a very ancient past. And how this kind of culture could be compared with other small or more minor, how do we say that? Cultures that belong to minorities. So their view was not to push classical studies as something that had to do with the superiority of ancient Greece, but with its comparison with other cultures through which we could have a new glance on the ancient Greek culture. So that's something very important. The comparative reading, for me, very important is the dimension of jouissance that we can have from parts and bits of this culture. We can, for example, read texts such as Xenophon's text that where the woman is the equal of an ox and the ox is more useful than a woman, and you have first to try to find an ox and then to find a woman. So that's one kind of thinking. But we have also, for example, Prometheus Unbound, which is a play where you can have inside a lot of questions that have to do with techniques, with man's position on the earth, with questions of power and of exile and of exertion of power. So we can apply this critical reading in a way to re-understand the classical texts in order not to make them comparable or equal to something that is privileged and belonging to a model that has to do with high culture, etc., etc. So we can think about a non-idealization of the ancient Greek culture and of a way of reading it again through new eyes, new glance, to have a new glance. As always, through history, I think Vasilis Lambropoulos mentioned that, through history, and everybody from all the other speakers mentioned that each epoch has a new kind of glance and reading that does to the text and to the other objects of the culture. What else I would like to say? I would like to say that this idea of the assemblage can also help us as creators, readers / creators, to remodel the stories and the myths. The myths are a kind of a symbolic system that we can reinterpret in different ways, as is history also. For example, Thucydides that Roberto Bolano was using in his text, he speaks about the kinds of exertion of power from the Athenian Empire that are very violent and very traumatic for a whole people, without exemplifying it, without, in a way, criticizing it. So also, I'm now working on things that have to do with animals, and my last book that is not yet published is about the myth of Aidon, the nightingale, and Helidon, the swallow. So this is a myth that it's very rich for our today's understanding of the woman's situation, of rape and women's solidarity and things like that. I don't know, I was perhaps I was very dispersed on what I was saying, but yeah, that's it for the moment, I think. Thank you very much. And sorry if I...
No, thank you so much. You are all anxious about the time, but somewhere in the middle of Roberto's speech, there came a small notification that says gift from Zoom, we will not limit your time. So obviously our 45 minutes passed and we are still here. It's a small miracle. So we can continue as long as you guys want. There is no need for you guys, to have the stress about time anymore, which is great. So now we can do two things. We can either make you guys engage with each other, or you can take the questions from the audience. So what do you think would be the best?
If people have any remarks to make, either through chat or orally, I think it would be nice to hear from anybody who has been watching, listening to us.
Yes, I would also, I would think that it would be great to engage the audience. So people, if you are new to Zoom, there is in the bottom left corner of your Zoom is the mute button. So you can unmute yourself and ask something. We will see you directly, or you can write it in chat. There is also in this line under your window where you see us, there is the icon of chat, so you can write there too. So whatever you guys prefer, if you have any questions.
It would be also nice to hear from our chair, from the chair of our panel.
Who is the chair of the panel? Is it me?
I think so.
It's a democracy. We are all the.
We are a direct democracy here.
Yeah. Can I make a side remark where I think it's about the Americans. They are too crucial. I think we have a few people from the United States listening to us, but the Americans, they are too crucial. And it's interesting that when Vasilis was quoting the Trump's executive order that had been revoked, that is just one of many. But the terms in which he speaks, it's very frightening to see that the terms in which he speaks, about architecture, which is something that we engage with every day. There's no way around it. It really pinpoints in a slightly less elaborate vocabulary the theories of the Nazis with the degenerate art. It is what it comes with an echo of. It is interesting that Roberto mentioned the US as an empire, because I always I don't know, maybe for me, the side of American culture that is most present to me, it is not so much what we are seeing now. It's it's America as a source of joy and of inspiration in many ways. It's great. I met Walt Whitman and jazz music and the freedom of gigantic cities. But it's interesting that Gore Vidal, when he talked about the US in its entanglement with the Romans, he never mentioned America as an empire. His identification with the US was with the Republic. He saw the US as an heir to the Roman Republic, not to the empire. And it's interesting that as much as we are tiptoeing around this tension of the idea of the Western tradition, which we can try and throw out of the window, but I don't think it's the most productive way to go about this dialogue at all. Still, he tried to see it as a liberal democracy in a way, but his label for that was Republic. Sorry, this is not very productive, but it's a provocation.
This is an ongoing conversation in the US, whether the country is a democracy or a republic. And right now, for the last 4 years, of course, the Trumpers have been emphasizing that it is a republic, and Trump never used the word democracy. But it is very interesting that so many aspects of American domestic or international policy, so many aspects of American society, American culture are debated through the Greeks and the Romans. And this opens for us a huge domain where we can participate, intervene, contest, and so on. So that shows the urgent nature of the ancient material. One thing that I liked about our one of the many things I liked about our panel is how we have left behind the idea of the Greek miracle and the Greek harmony and the Greek continuity, and that all of us seem to operate with notions of inconsistency, contradiction, ambiguity, and contestation. And so now we can move really into interesting, now that we have left behind the traditional German, if you will, humanistic, Bildungscentered Greek ideal, and we can now we can make the Greeks and the Romans our equal interlocutors and have them be part of a conversation that now, again, as I think all of us, most of us implied, but can include almost every culture in the world and every tradition.
We have a comment in chat. B. Hofsvetter, I'm one of those Americans. I don't think the average American sees America as an empire, but simply as a good place to live and are glad to be here. But Trump and others misappropriate the classical tradition for their own purposes, and this must be fought tooth and nail, as they say. The question is how we do so. I think this is a great perspective because it says about misappropriation of classical tradition. Because I think the root of all the problem is about continuous misappropriating of the Greco-Roman traditions to justify one or the other political goal or a narrative or even some scientific narratives. And the question is really how to fight it. Also, other comment, Ilias Kolokiris. Hello, and thank you all for the wonderful discussion. I wanted to ask a question concerning the present and future of classics. Lately, quite often has been mentioned, mostly in American academia, that ancient Greek statues were not white, and that this whiteness was a myth that led to the appropriation of classics by ultra-conservative scholars. I'm not questioning the statement of this idea. I'm questioning whether this idea of non-whiteness is something new. Is it yes? Winkelmann did produce this idea. Yes, some classic scholars have been ultra-conservative, but were there not other receptions of classical antiquity as colored before articles like this one? And then he links the New Yorker article from 2018, The Myth of Whiteness in Classical Sculpture. I think I actually read that article when it went out, and it was very interesting for me to see that, you know, all this white perfect marble was actually something lively and colorful and so more close to my aesthetics. Then I actually started, like, you know, trying to explore the Greek aesthetics when I understood it's not just boring white, it was also color. So do you guys want to comment on this?
Yeah, can I jump in and I think someone else might, I suspect Phoebe might be able to help me a bit on commenting on this question about Winkelmann and the origins of white statues. It is a lot of fun to see them in color. It's an incredible joy. Here in the museum, they did an experiment in which they traced the pigments, and one of my favorite objects in the entire museum for a long time was this lion that they managed to determine was yellow and this absolutely ravenous blue. He had a blue what's the word in English? The hair that the lion has around. And it was just, you know,
the mane?
To just take a walk there and stare at this lion that had the happiest the happiest colors ever. But the question of Winkelmann, Winkelmann was problematic in his own time, actually, like most ancient classics. I think that when he's reading, so I think the way in which he establishes himself as a sort of is deemed by a lot of people as the father of art history. One of the ways in which he establishes himself with that kind of legitimacy, it's with an essay that he writes about the Laocoon, the group of statues that is found in Rome. And it's one of these textbook analyses of Greece as a kind of ancient Greek art as a kind of paradigmatic expression of stoic and self-contained, controlled emotions. And one of the contemporaries of Winkelmann was the much less famous, but perhaps equally interesting for art historians, Lessing. Lessing was a man from a very different background from Winkelmann. And he pretty much says, Stoicism and being self-contained, my ass, look at the pain in their faces. They are about to burst in that statue. And here you have two extremely clever men, by all accounts, disagreeing over something that the problem is what they bring into themselves. But to their credit, I think both of them were trying to get to some kind of objective reading of what it meant. Where classics gets problematic is where it gets entangled with the classics is in a way harmless, despite its many shortcomings and its terrible past. It's when it gets entangled with our agendas, because it holds a gigantic amount of authority. And
but it is at this point where exactly the whiteness becomes normative.
Yeah, exactly. And it's Winkelmann and this exemplary, this idea that classics are to be held as an example due to moral authority.
So when our first writer says the question we have, it must be fought tooth and nail, the question is how we do so, perhaps by contesting classical orthodoxies such as whiteness, such as everything Greek was uniquely Greek.
Yeah.
There are all these fights, let's call it, that we can give over Winkelmannian and other orthodoxies and normativities.
And sorry to interrupt you, Vasilis, but
No, please.
I think this is something very relevant, because in a way it's something that will also save classics from stagnation as a discipline. I think that some of the most interesting research that it's there to be made, and some of the most interesting stories that are there to be told, are those of the people who, being a part of the classical world, saw their voice excluded. We don't have enough, literary and artistic sources, but we still have enough sources to try and piece together their stories, and we can try and emphasize that side of the classical world. It's there to be explored, and I'm absolutely certain that some of the most challenging and interesting research we will see coming out of classics in the next few years will be tied with that. I had a remark to the first person of the chat. I'm speaking outside of an American context, so I don't know enough. I can try and share a bit of my experience as someone who is a foreigner living in glorious Brexit land, a gift that keeps on giving.
Oh my God.
It is very, very hard.
My condolences.
It is, thank you. It is very hard to, I think we assume that it's us and them, and it is to a certain extent not that much of a clear cut. We are them in certain ways. And what I find it is really hard to do is how you denounce certain discourses without attacking them. Or, because we will have to live around people who do not necessarily believe the same things we do. But, how can you hold a dialogue that is productive and can, try and show. For a long time, I was just simply convinced that people who vote for things like Brexit or Trump are just simply morally flawed. That morally speaking, something went wrong. But it is not as clear cut as that. Sadly, in a way, because it makes things much more complicated and harder to navigate, I think.
I think.
So if I may say something, I had just a couple of remarks. So the first comment, I absolutely understand. I mean, I don't know if you can tell from the way I speak. I'm a very culturally, I'm partly or very Americanized to some extent, and I grew up in a country that was under the influence of the United States, the constant influence of the United States. That is Colombia. Of course, most Americans don't see the United States as an empire. Most Americans also don't care about the classics. And I think this is important because I think we tend to confuse things. But I will just go back to this as someone who comes from a country that has been a victim of American imperialism. It's a different perspective. America, maybe on a civic level, on day-to-day basis, in the way that people communicate, is just a normal country like every country in the world. On the level of global political situation, America tries to dominate the world. I mean, at least in part, it's not the only power, and it has done it for a couple of centuries now, just as France did it before, just as England did it before. There is a form of imperialism that is incarnated, embodied at the international level by the United States. It doesn't mean that Americans are bad people. But I think when I talk about empire and the United States, this is what I was referring to. I'm not referring to the ideology that every American is a bad imperialist or an evil person. Of course not.
Yeah.
And also, these questions are much larger than the realm of classics. Obviously, there are entanglements, but I think that to some extent, the work that we do in classics to disentangle classical past from ideological constructs is something that has to be done at all levels of society. And what we do in classics departments can be very important, but it's just a part of a larger struggle for a fairer and more equal political stage for political debate. And because when I was doing my presentation, something got erased from my one of my conclusions, and I wanted to go back to what Vasilis was saying, because it was extremely interesting, and I think he has a very, very good point, and that is that indeed what we agree on, I think, is that there are two large illusions regarding the ancient world. That is, first, the illusion of continuity, that we whoever we are somehow tied to whoever the Greeks and the Romans were, and by a link that is unbreakable and that is continuous. And this continuity can be spatial as well. And that goes along with the illusion of identity. That is, that we identify with the Greeks or with the Romans for whatever reasons, although we are evidently not the ancient Greeks and not the ancient Romans. In Greece, it's even more complicated, because obviously in Greece, people speak Greek. It's the same country where most of ancient Greek history happened. So people tend to be under this, and not only that, but in Greece, this is complicated by Philhellenism and European Western European colonialism, in the fact that Greeks have been denied equal access to classical antiquity in the past. So when you talk to Greek philologists or people who work in Greek departments of classics, they feel that people from Germany or France think that their approach and their take on ancient classics is not as legitimate as theirs. So it complicates things. So I just wanted to go back to these points, and I also put a link on the page on the chat about statues and whiteness and color and so on.
Yes, thank you. We have two new messages, so I will read them, and maybe then we will encourage Phoebe more to
Yes.
assert herself. I know it is a lot of us, but we want to hear your opinion. We don't
Yes.
want you to feel excluded, especially because we are speaking about contemporary Greeks, and you are a Greek, and we are not, and then we are talking, and you are not. So let's read the messages, and maybe then to ask you for your opinion. Ashley Haram says, I find that our undergraduate students at the University of California at Santa Cruz are very interested in learning about Greek and Roman mythology as one of their elective classes, which would be a large lecture class. But they generally feel constrained to finish their degrees as quickly as possible for financial reasons, so are reluctant to study the languages. Their enthusiasm for learning about the myths seems quite detached from their general concerns about the US as an empire and about racial injustice in the US, both of which concerns are very prominent at this school. So this is a very interesting insight from the field, how it actually looks when you combine, many different layers of the language barrier, the stress of the formal education that relies on student debt or financial income and stuff like that, which puts you in time pressure to consume the education, not to engage yourself in a dialogue with it. So I think it is very important to tackle also the class or economic status as topics of approachability of classics, but also the language barrier, because I think we also had some interesting remarks in postmodernist spirit that not knowing the language you can turn into advantage, because then you read the similar versions of the same text, which would be actually very similar to what was happening in ancient times of ancient epic poetry, which was improvised based on samples. So I think that diminishing of one original could also be very interesting to go back to understand it with a different way that is different from our literary minds, which
I can,
fixate the text.
for me, it's one of the most interesting parts of ancient Greek poetry, the way it has been read recently as a product of orality, as a product of communities, I mean communities of poets, of series of poets, like a kind of a poetry that is worked and elaborated from poet to poet, and then at a certain point it is written. So this oral origin of poetry, which is the other opposite of idealization through writing and fixing a masterpiece by writing, I think is something that is very interesting for our conception of ancient Greece towards this kind of perspective that is not idealized and that is not also used for appropriation for conservative reasons. I mean, this line of thinking, for example, in Greece is not at all for the conservative part of the society, is not at all on fashion, let's say. And usually students in the school, they learn, for example, about the oral origin of the Homeric epics, but the idea of one Homer who existed and wrote this masterpiece still exists in the minds of the people. So, for example, me, when I have students and we are reading poetry, ancient Greek poetry, and we're discussing subjects like that, it reminds me what Tatiana said before about her classes. It totally changes their mind and their idea of what it was and what they have been told that it was. And to tell the truth, most of the students here in Greece have the opposite reaction. I mean, they don't want to be taught ancient Greek poetry. Despite they don't like it at all, because they have a certain kind of mind washing from their first years in school till the end of the school, that is concentrated on ancient Greek texts and ancient Greek history, etc., etc., but through the Winkelmann's eye. So they are totally not interested on that. And it's a discovery when they learn these kinds of reading. And to tell this, I must say that we have the opposite complex of inferiority. I mean, in Greece, that we don't have to read these texts or to be interested in these texts, because exactly they had this kind of ideological appropriation. So in a way, we are in a very difficult position, because from a certain point, we are considered to be the heirs of this culture. And from the other point, we are not entitled to do that. And we have to be modern and metropolitan, and we have to speak about modern life as if one cannot speak about modern life with using motifs or myths or things like that, or as if Greek language is not the language we speak, because even if it's one cannot really understand when he doesn't know ancient Greek, he cannot understand the text, but you can learn a lot about the history of the words, the meanings of the words, and the social history of the words. I mean, now, for example, the reading of Benveniste of the ancient Greek vocabulary has to do with the social structures that were behind that. So, and Saint-Reine, for example, in France. So this kind of work is, in a way, put out of our questioning. And it becomes much more complicated if we are thinking in terms of disciplines. For example, the discipline of archaeology is a very conservative discipline in Greece. It's based upon very strong stereotypes, Winkelmann stereotypes in a way. And till very recently, there wasn't any kind of critique of this inside the discipline of Greek archaeology. I mean, only the last years we started, they started, I'm not an archaeologist, disentangling the themes and the subjects that were our, how do we say this word, that we are found with in our hands. They never were questioning them. It was taken as a fact. So this is not science. This is not a questioning, because it had to do with the conception of the modern Greek state, as I explained you before. And only very, very recently, this building, which is well built, our, for example, Minister of Culture, which is now entangled in a lot of things that I cannot say now in an audience that doesn't know. She's with this nationalistic archaeological view of what is Greece today. So we have also the problem of the disciplines that cannot change because of their relationship with power and the state power and the national history.
Thank you. This is a lot of very interesting insights. I wonder if any of you, Roberto, Tatiana, Vasilis, you want to comment?
I just, well, just because I see that also there are a lot of people who are maybe want to ask another question. We have a question that maybe we haven't addressed, I think.
We only have your
on-
interaction with your new pen friend.
Yes, no, yes. No, but
That
it was
is
just
all.
like,
Do you
I
want
just
us
tried
to read
to,
your letters to each other?
no, not that one, not that one. No, no, no. That
Just-
was just like, I just wanted to make clear the point I was making. Now,
But-
before that, we have a question that's more tied to education.
language
You-
and
Yes.
and I would like to hear from Ashley who posed the question, because I instead of trying to reply, it would be very hard to do that, but I was wondering, both for Ashley and Vasilis, what's the proportion of their students who actually try to study classical languages, and it's a sad thing to hear that they are constrained by the amount of debt with which they graduate.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
Oh, but no, you do.
Oh, well, thank
Ashley,
you.
you do, please.
Thank you. Well, I would say very few of them. I mean, shockingly few in a way. I consider myself somewhat of a proselytizer in that I try to draw students in to studying the languages, and I have only once succeeded, and I have almost succeeded a few times, but then the students will say, oh, I didn't realize it would take more than one quarter, because they had one more quarter open to them, even just to learn the language. Like they thought that they might treat themselves to learning Greek or Roman in their last quarter at the school. Like they just, instead of thinking it would be the foundation for then majoring in classics, they're really viewing it more as something that would be enjoyable, and as sort of a frosting on the cake maybe for their education. And so the actual classics program, which is within the literature program, which is not devoted to any one single literature, it's very small, but it's an excellent program. It's just that there are so very, very few students in it.
In general, the undergraduate who tells their family, their friends, that they are going to learn not only Greek and Latin, but even Russian or German, their circle will make fun of them. You want to learn German? What for? Okay, Russian? What for? Unless you become, you go to the CIA or something. So in general, the foreign languages are not popular these days.
Humanities in general, not and humanities in general.
Mhm.
Humanities and the sciences. You don't have people who say, I want to study chemistry.
Mhm.
I want to study math as such, as math, physics as physics. These things are out. On the other hand, those who pursue these things are incredibly passionate, and often they may be minorities. They may be the first member of their family who goes to college and so on. So they are people who see that as an intellectual challenge and are willing to invest the time and the energy it takes.
Yes, I mean, some perspectives on education, some humanist perspectives on education see it as a thing that has a purpose in itself. But today, education, it doesn't have a purpose to itself. It's relocated to the employability, to the market, and especially the more education costs, the more is it relocated its purpose outside, So that is why everything that is not instantly lucrative is instantly visible what you will actually do to repay what you invested, because you see it as consumerist act, as consuming a package of skills that will allow you to gather financial gain. They don't see it as a humanist project of self-improvement, because it's impossible to go in depth to self-improve. It's almost Don Quixotean to see today. In Croatia, we have this switch from the first perspective to the second since the 90s. And that is why I can say that I am witnessing generation by generation how this changes. For instance, when I started studying, the generations before me, they were all into this humanist, knowledge is freedom and knowledge is power, and it should be available to you, and the curricula shouldn't be made to suit the employability. Then the few generation passed, and the youngest generation now is saying this knowledge doesn't empower us, doesn't make us capable to earn money for ourselves. We will go out, we will not have money, we will not have food and rent. And they say that for them, the power of knowledge is something else. The essence of education completely changed. So I think this is a very good perspective on what happens to classics and language, because it is not a lucrative, it is not like management. And I think Roberto or Vasilis, you said it about physics and maths. I think you, Vasilis, said it. I have a friend who said, I love like theoretic maths. I will never get funding for this. I will never get funding for me to just dwell on my numbers, which I love. I will never get funding. They will fund those guys who will go to space. You know, that is what he said. And even in STEM, you have to be, you know, enough. Even it got even to STEM, this logic. And we knew that 5 years ago, STEM was the holy cow of capitalist perspective of education. Now even STEM have the problem with, will I get the funding for my playing with numbers? Now even playing with numbers is not good enough. What is then happening with somebody who learns ancient Greek?
Yeah, but you know, it's two things that are, I think, tied, Maria. One is that the more pressure you have, the more debt you acquire as you're trying to graduate and acquire an education, the more pressured you are to get into the job market and get a job fast. It is actually a reality that was very alien to me until I started working around English people, because in Portugal you graduate with no debt. It's a symbolic amount of money you pay for. It is actually one of the things that during the crisis in the 2000s allowed us to requalify, and a lot of people went back to school and studied other things because they couldn't get to the job market. But it is interesting to see that it's actually a misconception for most employers, at least from my experience in the job market. What you study and the job you do are two things that are not necessarily tied at all. When you are fairly young and you get out of academia with your degree and you are applying for a job, there's a range of skills you can acquire while you're studying. And actually no degree will ever teach you a job. I don't know, unless you are someone who is studying medicine, or even then there's a great practical component. And the only way you actually learn a job is by doing it, and is by being trained at it.
I agree. Yeah.
And it is actually a kind of it's a vicious cycle, and also in, I think, a lot of cases, a mischaracterization. If you can teach yourself ancient Greek, you can teach yourself how to work with a database, and that's a valuable skill.
Yes, and many critical theorists emphasize the importance of teaching about especially ancient, cultures and times, because to make that mental switch, to distance yourself so much into past and see it as somehow similar and connected to your existence, but also something completely different, it makes you understand and reflect better critically on everything that surrounds you, but also encourages empathy in you to understand that with everything, no matter how far away, you can find something in common, but that also you can't see everything through your own lenses. Quick question for all of you. Studying classics as like humanist thing, what did it give to you in sense of personal growth? Like, what is when you will look at the end of everything, like what is something that you will say, I'm happy as a person I was a part of this because it gave me this and that? Quick, without a lot of thinking.
A good grasp of Western civilization, not the rest, not of that particular trajectory.
Questioning about a lot of things. Continuous questioning about what is this, why it is like that, how can we find another similar thing, how can we read it in another way, why this way is the appropriate way and another way is not the appropriate way, how can we speak, how the things can speak the one to the other. I think it was a for me because I did my studies at this particular place. For me, it was a totally new way of apprehending the questioning upon texts and cultural objects at the same time.
Do you want to go, Roberto, or do you? You know, I did not want to get an education in classics to become a classicist. That was never what I wanted to do in a way. I wanted to get an education that allowed me to become a writer, and having absolutely zero practical inclinations, I did not want to become a journalist either. So I thought that classics was a nice thing to study if you wanted to be a writer, which, you know, I was very young when I made this decision and fairly immature. But having said that, I'm so immensely, I never regretted, not for a second, that I studied classics. I'm so immensely grateful for having been allowed to do it. You know, you learn about philosophy, you learn about history, you learn about archaeology, you learn about literature. It combines so many relevant subjects to read the world you live in. And then, you know, there's just such immense joy in being able to read certain poets. You know, it's Catullus, for instance, who is, you know, this highly vulgar poet from antiquity, is such a joy to be able to read them in the original. It's its own reward. Or Homer, or, you know, and I feel that it tied me to countries that were not mine, and I feel that in a way they kind of are. I think that stays with you. So I think in the end was a kind of an accidental journey that became many things. Yeah.
Okay, so it's, I don't know, my question, I mean, I don't know what from what I get, I don't know exactly what relationship you have with Latin and Greek in your everyday lives. I know more or less what relationship Tatiana has with the classics in her more or less everyday life. I teach Latin and Greek almost every day. I read Latin and Greek almost every day, and I spend my life doing Latin and Greek stuff. So it's I don't really know how to answer that question. It's a very strange question, but to me, because everybody asks that question, right? Why do you do classics? What does classics give you? I don't really know, because I'm also a very skeptical person. I'm very wary of claims to universality. I'm very wary of everything we know. I don't know if I agree with these takes, but I'm very wary of the universal subject. I'm very wary of claims about human nature, claims about human. I do agree with that, because that's what I feel when I read these books. But at the same time, all the critical theory that has been amassed in the last century goes against these ideas, and they deconstruct everything we know for sure. So I don't really know. At any rate, on a daily basis, I just get immense pleasure from reading these texts. And these are the people I magically chose to be my life to some extent. I wanted to learn Latin when I was a kid for reasons that I can't explain. I was in Colombia, the place that was not as far as anything from Greece and Rome, but very far away from anything that had to do with antiquity. Maybe in a practical matter, it would be more of it made me want to study more languages. And after learning Latin and Greek, I started learning things like Arabic that that are part of my, like, that have become my subjects of research. So, you know, it has opened up my mind in a way. I don't know if it is because it intrinsically pushes you that way. It's certainly an incredible literature, but maybe you can say the same thing about Tamil literature or about Sanskrit. I don't know. It is limited. And I just to not throw a question back to you guys. This discussion about, yes, Western civilization, in what prompted, you know, my reaction to this topic was the article of the New York Times on Daniel Padilla Peralta and the way that classics are being deconstructed in the United States and in the academic world. So one of the things that comes back very often is the question of Western civilization. What is Western civilization? Is there such a thing? And
I don't
I
care.
don't know. Well, I'm not trying to solve this question right now. I'm just asking. The question is not that. My question is, what do we do if we get rid of this label, Western civilization? What do we do with classics? I mean, how do we teach them, and what do they become? Do you have any?
Yes, we have to get rid of this idea of Western civilization. I think you're right.
It's still there, you know. It's
yeah, that's true. But as you answered, we can have the pleasure. You spoke about the pleasure, Tatiana. I think the whole answer you had was about that.
And I think we forget the joyful side, but we shouldn't be too bent on it as well, because the danger is that, you know, we need to remember the things that are not so great about the classical world. And
no, we can remember the things that are not so well about the contemporary world, first of all, and then we can have the pleasure we want to have from anything we want. I think I am not for censorship of what I think is really it has life inside for me. I find the response when I see it or read it, and from wherever it comes from, I don't want to. I don't think it's a good thing to be under censorship if we feel things like that. Yeah. The problems that had to do with the contemporary society are not the same. I mean, it's not the same to study classical studies and to be a racist. It's not the same. It's not the same. I mean, we have to dissociate this, because we start being a little bit, I don't know the word, we feel guilty. I don't think we have to feel guilty. We have to see the contemporary situation as it is and criticize it and be for what we want to be better, etc. But then the text, they didn't do the harm. I mean, the harm is somewhere else. It's not.
Roberto, sorry, Phoebe. Roberto, can I throw your question back at you as a provocation? One of my favorite moments in modern Greek literature happens in Seferis, in Mythistorema. And it's in the third section, in which he says, I carried this marble head in my hands, and it is so heavy. But then, you know, Seferis goes on to write in massively productive ways in his work about the ancient Greek world, and, you know, he holds Aeschylus really up high, and it's pretty much most of his moral system. And, you know, it is also the country of his imagination in many ways. So, you know, it's heavy, but it's hard to throw it out the window.
Western civilization is, to me, this incredible apparatus that in the name of universality wanted to conquer the world.
Okay, we agree on that.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that's why I want to understand it, because it is this war machine, as Deleuze would say, that went to war against the rest of the world and conquered it. And I think we need to discontinue that project, to discredit and discontinue that project, we really need to understand the incredibly seductive language that it used, the incredibly attractive and what appeared to be inclusive and essentially was incredibly exclusive discourse. And so if that project is hopefully coming to an end, the project of the Eurocentric civilization, then we need to really understand its mechanisms. It's not enough to be against it. It's like patriarchy. We're all against patriarchy, but it survived because it was so incredibly successful as a mechanism. So understanding these mechanisms that used a universalist, a universalizing language to determine not just thinking, but conduct. I think we want to do that to make sure that we don't return to it.
This is a very good point. Now at this point, it's almost 2 hours of our beautiful time that because it was so beautiful, we didn't notice it lasting for so long. So I wonder whether you guys want to continue it. I'm very interested if you want to continue it. If you don't want to continue it, tell me that you are tired, that you told somebody else you will go somewhere else half an hour ago.
I think we owe it to our very generous and wonderful viewers and listeners to stop here.
Okay, this is a good moment.
You thought I would say to continue? No.
No, I was sure that you were going to say to stop.
Okay, so guys, last chance to ask our wonderful panelists last questions before we disappear forever from this Zoom and go only in fragments like the old man. Angelis, Marianos, we could listen to you all night. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All night. That's the problem. You have been Hofsvetter. You have been wonderful. I hope you I hope you make this available for future review. We will do our best. Angelis, Marianos, thank you for wonderful conversation. Ashley, Heron, thank you. So you have charmed the audience too, not just me and each other. So I'm very happy, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
all.
Maria, thank you so much for your wonderful hospitality and for inviting us.
Yes.
Thank you, Maria.
Yes. Thank you.
You've been also wonderful, and audience, of course, thank you for lasting this long with us. I'm happy that you liked it.
Yeah.
So now we can end this.
The awkward Zoom moment. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.